primary functions of Congress is to represent the people of the United States. Let's take a brief look at the issue of representation and how Congress performs with regard to this important function. First, let's clarify a few terms. Representation, at its most basic level, is the act of speaking on behalf of someone else. If we break down the roots of the word, we get the idea of making something present again. In this case, the voice of the people in a legislative body, even when the people themselves cannot physically be in attendance. The idea of representation is an ancient one, but there are ongoing debates about how it should actually be carried out. We'll get to that in a second. When we talk about representation, there are two parties that are critical to that act. The first party is the representative, the person who speaks on others' behalf. The second party is the constituent, the person who is being spoken for by the representative. As I just mentioned, there are conflicting ideas about how representation ought to work. The first part of this conflict has to do with what's called substantive representation. This dimension of representation has to do with reflecting the views and interests of constituents. There are differing views about how to achieve substantive representation. The first is what's called the trustee view. It was originally spelled out by Edmund Burke, an 18th century British political philosopher and elected representative in the House of Commons. Burke argued that representatives should do their best to understand the views of their constituents and take those views into consideration, but ultimately it was up to the representative to exercise his best judgment about what was best for his constituents and for the nation as a whole. In this view, the voters choose representatives who are deemed to have good judgment and broadly reflect the principles and political viewpoint of the voters. However, since the voters themselves have only very limited information about the details of public policy, it's up to the representative to make wise decisions, even when a majority of constituents might disagree. The delegate view is the opposite of the trustee view. The delegate view argues that representatives should faithfully uphold their constituents' preferences, even if the representative disagrees. In other words, the job of the representative is to ascertain public opinion as best as possible, and then follow that opinion, regardless of personal view. Generally speaking, members of Congress represent the substantive views of their constituents fairly well. As your textbook mentions, political science studies have found that members of Congress vote according to the preferences of their constituents about 2/3 of the time. Now, you can make a pretty good argument that 2/3 is far too low. But it's also true that the higher profile an issue is to voters, for instance, things like healthcare, abortion, or gun law, the more likely it is that that representative will abide by the opinion of their constituents. It's generally on lower profile issues where representatives feel they have more leeway to chart their own course. Another dimension of representation is descriptive representation. This gets at how much a representative body reflects important politically relevant demographic characteristics in society. So things like race and ethnicity, gender, social class, religion, and age. As we'll see in a moment, Congress in general, and the Senate in particular, are a very poor representational match to the broader society. Now, there's some debate about how much emphasis should be placed upon descriptive representation. So one school of thought argues that as long as elected officials do a good job of representing the views and the interests of their constituents, well, then the demographic descriptors of those representatives really don't matter that much. So, think, for example, maybe of a female voter who considers herself to be pro-life. So in other words, would like to see abortion either outlawed or greatly restricted. She may face a choice in an election between two candidates, one who is a man who also reflects her views on abortion, the other a female candidate who is a supporter of abortion rights. So even though the female candidate in this particular election may represent this voter descriptively, the voter is probably more likely to choose the male candidate in this race who does a better job of representing her substantively. In other words, matches her views on the issue of abortion. So that's one view of descriptive representation. But another view, and one that I think is probably more important, holds that descriptive representation is important both symbolically and substantively. So symbolically, it's important to have representative bodies that reflect the diversity of society at large in order for those decisions of legislatures to be viewed as legitimate. So for example, the symbolic importance of descriptive representation was illustrated in pretty dramatic fashion during the 2018 confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And those hearings are pictured here on this slide. So when Christine Blasey Ford was called to testify before this committee about the alleged sexual assault that she suffered at the hands of Kavanaugh, the Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee faced a dilemma. There had never been a female Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and having an all-male panel question the veracity of Dr. Ford's testimony, would make them look quite bad. So they yielded their questioning time to an outside female prosecutor, pictured here, just for this hearing. That's a very unusual step for a congressional committee to take, basically giving over their right to ask questions of witnesses to an outside questioner. So this symbolic act begs the question, are we really supposed to believe that there'd never been any Republican women qualified enough to serve on this important committee as of 2018? Obviously not. But then why had all the Republicans who had ever served on this committee been men? So how are we supposed to consider the actions of a committee such as this that legislates on important things like reproductive health issues? How are we supposed to consider those decisions legitimate when it has consistently excluded women's voices? The lack of descriptive representation here is an indication that there remain societal obstacles to equal treatment. Now, I've been picking on Republicans in this example, and it's certainly true that the Republican Party has much less diversity in its congressional membership. But I should also point out that it's only been in recent years that the Democratic Party in Congress has even begun to come close to matching the diversity of American society at large. So it remains an ongoing issue to keep moving toward a Congress that looks like the country as a whole. Now, beyond the symbolic importance for indicating that all voices are heard, descriptive representation is also important because it can go hand in hand with substantive representation. The idea here is that demographic characteristics play a role in our life experiences and our understanding of society and public issues. So having a more descriptively diverse legislature, that's a legislature that's more likely going to be one in which representatives have a richer, more personal understanding of the difficulties that different Americans face, and therefore can do a better job of representing their substantive interests in Congress. So how descriptively representative is Congress? Unfortunately, the answer is not very, although the House does quite a bit better than the Senate. So let's take a look at some key numbers, beginning with the House of Representatives. So in January of 2021, the 117th Congress was sworn into office. At that time, there were 222 Democrats, 211 Republicans, and 2 vacancies in the House. Just as a little bit of a side note to show that sometimes every vote really does matter, one of the vacancies in the House was due to the fact that the race in New York's 22nd district was still undecided 2 months after Election Day, because out of over 300,000 votes cast, the difference in the count between the 2 leading candidates was only 29 votes, and lawsuits were still ongoing about whether some ballots that had initially been rejected should be included in the count. Now, 28% of legislators in the House of Representatives are women. While this is far from parity, it does represent a substantial step in the right direction, as there are several more women serving in the House of Representatives today than at any other point in the country's history. As recently as 2017, women made up only 19% of members of the House. So the last couple of elections have entailed pretty huge steps forward for women's representation in Congress. In terms of racial and ethnic diversity, about 12% of the members of the House are African American, 9% are Hispanic, and 4% are Asian American. This is relatively close to the racial and ethnic demographics for the country as a whole. So part of the story here for why the House of Representatives does a pretty good job of being descriptively representative in terms of race and ethnicity is the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which outlawed gerrymandering, or the drawing of district lines, to try to dilute the voting strength of minority groups. So in other words, this is the one type of gerrymandering that the courts have said is not allowed. Gerrymandering meant to dilute the voting power of racial and ethnic minorities. So the 1965 Voting Rights Act has been hugely important for allowing heavily minority towns and regions to send members of their communities to Congress, really for the first time, since the end of Reconstruction. While the House is relatively racially diverse, only about 4% of its members were born outside the United States. This is much lower than the 15% of people who now reside in the U.S. who are foreign born. So we can see here that immigrants are quite heavily underrepresented in Congress. The average age of a member of Congress, the average age of a member of the House is 58 years old. And it's not too surprising that members of the House would be well into their adulthoods, since this is not an entry-level job being a member of Congress. But even so, it's pretty striking just how old most members of Congress are. So there's not a whole lot of age diversity in Congress. And then finally, the average member of the House has served about 8 years in office, meaning that they've served on average for about 4 terms. So while there are a handful of representatives who have been in the House for decades, the turnover rate in the House is actually relatively high. The Senate is currently comprised of 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans. Although the major parties are tied in terms of their membership in the Senate, the Democrats are considered the majority party because Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris casts the tie-breaking vote. So in 2021, we have what is called unified government, meaning the Democrats control the White House with President Biden, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. This is actually pretty unusual in recent American political history. For the overwhelming majority of the last half century, we have had what's called divided government, in which each party controls at least one institution of the federal government. Okay, back to the Senate. 24 women currently serve in the Senate, so slightly lower than the House of Representatives in terms of women's representation. But where the Senate is much less diverse than the House of Representatives is in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, with only 3 African American senators, 6 Hispanic senators, and 2 Asian American members of the Senate. The average senator is 64 years old, so even older than in the House. And the average senator has been in their seat in the Senate for an average of 10 years, so a little less than 2 terms in the Senate. And finally, about half of the current membership of the Senate has previously served in the House. And this illustrates that the Senate is considered to be the more prestigious chamber in Congress, as politicians sometimes use their seats in the House of Representatives as a stepping stone to get to the Senate.